Daniel Callihan was born on September 13, 1987, in the state of Mississippi. He was the oldest of 3 children. All the children had different fathers, so their mother, mired in the search for phantom happiness, could in no way serve as a role model. The woman constantly entered into toxic relationships with different men. Many of them were dependent on prohibited substances or abused alcohol. That is, they were real monsters who never missed an opportunity to humiliate or hit. The mother did not care at all about her children and their well-being. Because of constant problems with the law and money, the family moved from place to place. In 1 year, the children changed 12 schools. By that time, chaos was already reigning in the children's heads. They did not even have time to remember the names of new teachers before they had to pack their things again. However, the moves were not the worst thing. Their life was a real waking nightmare. Daniel and his younger brother and sister not only witnessed the brutal beatings of their mother by her drunken partners, but they themselves were often subjected to verbal humiliation and physical violence. The mother, having suffered from another tormentor, often took out her anger and resentment on her own children, lashing out at them for the slightest offense, or even without any reason because they got under her hot hand. The nightmare was further aggravated by the fact that Daniel was often subjected to lewd acts and molestation by one of the relatives, who took advantage of the boy's lack of supervision. The mother knew about this perfectly well. She saw everything with her own eyes, but did nothing. She remained silent, fearing to be left completely alone, or she was so deeply absorbed in her own personal problems that she did not care. She simply did not have the resources to protect her son. Daniel's childhood could not be called happy, even with a stretch. The children were not so much raised as they simply survived in conditions of total chaos, domestic cruelty, constant instability, and a complete lack of safety and comfort. They were constantly forgotten to be fed, not taken to school, and not bought warm clothes. They were simply neglected, left alone with the monsters who were supposed to be their family. Daniel's biological father was even worse than the mother. Wayne Drott was a murderer and a psychopath. At a music festival in New Orleans, Wayne met an 18-year-old girl, kidnapped her, beat her to death, and dumped her body in the river, then fled the scene of the crime. The body was found 3 weeks later. Fortunately, Drott was caught and arrested. The court sentenced him to 25 years in prison. But the story did not end there, because 4 years later, Daniel's father escaped from prison and kidnapped another 17-year-old girl who worked as a saleswoman in a store. Together with the captive, the man headed to Arkansas. He hid with her for more than 15 hours until the police caught up with them. A chase began. Daniel's father stopped the car and opened fire on law enforcement officers. The girl took advantage of the moment and jumped out of the vehicle. Thanks to a lucky coincidence, she survived. A shootout ensued between Daniel's father and the police. Eventually, he was surrounded, and he realized that he could not escape. Realizing the inevitability of arrest and a life sentence, Drott turned the pistol on himself and left this world. Help this channel grow. Like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more cases. This helps us a lot. Thank you. Wayne Drott's story looked more like a crime drama. However, the mother did not hide the terrible truth from her 7-year-old son and told Daniel what his dad had done. The fact that his biological father was a murderer severely traumatized Daniel's psyche. In addition, his mother repeatedly insisted that he would become just like his dad when he grew up. Considering what Daniel Callihan did later, this looked like a self-fulfilling prophecy. Literally from a young age, the mother planted in her son's head the idea that one day he would become a murderer, and it happened. At the age of 13, Daniel and the other children were finally taken away from their mother's custody and placed in foster families. Although the brother and sister were separated, it was better than remaining under the supervision of a woman who did not care at all about the well-being of her own children. Little is known about Daniel's upbringing in the foster family, but in his teenage years, he had to face many difficulties that only worsened over the years. Serious problems with the law began as soon as Daniel reached adulthood. Apparently, his mother's words that he would repeat his father's path were firmly lodged in his head. In 2006, at the age of 19, Daniel Callihan was arrested for burglary and other minor offenses. In 2008, he was detained for assault on family members and theft. Together with another relative, Callihan was charged with causing bodily harm with a glass jar. In 2009, he was arrested again for theft and illegal breaking into a vehicle. Daniel even stole from his own mother, but she did not press charges. Eventually, Callihan was sentenced to 12 years in prison. However, he got off scot-free again. Despite numerous arrests, the sentence was suspended. Although Daniel could now be considered a professional criminal, in 2008 he did something unexpected. He got married. His chosen one was a woman named Amber Boyd, who was a year older than him. It was a sudden decision that led to nothing good. The husband, who at first seemed to Amber like salvation and hope for a better life, very quickly turned into hell. Daniel displayed not just a hot-tempered character, but sadistic cruelty. He treated his wife terribly, humiliated, and insulted her at every opportunity, and also regularly raised his hand against her, taking out his anger after another failure. Callihan was almost constantly under the influence of prohibited substances. His mood swung from mind-blowing euphoria to wild, uncontrollable paranoia. When Amber finally realized that she had married a monster and tried to break the marriage bonds, it was already too late. He simply did not let her leave. Amber found herself in a real trap of cruel and abusive relationships, from which there seemed to be no way out. One day during an argument, Daniel, in a fit of rage, forcefully threw his wife onto a piece of concrete. She fell so unsuccessfully that she nearly injured her spine. Doctors later said that she miraculously remained unharmed. From the blow, strong swelling of the back muscles began, and for several days Amber could not walk, writhing in pain and realizing that she was completely dependent on her tormentor. Another time, Callihan, under the influence of prohibited substances, attacked her from behind and cut off her oxygen. There was no rope. He simply squeezed her neck with his hands, watching her suffer. Amber had to pretend that she had lost consciousness. The woman went limp and stopped showing signs of life, only so that Daniel would get scared and finally loosen his fingers. But even that was not all. In the heat of arguments, when words ran out, the man repeatedly grabbed a kitchen knife. He pressed the cold blade to his wife's throat, enjoying her horror, and threatened to rip open her stomach if she tried to run away or call for help. Amber lived in constant fear, not knowing if she would wake up tomorrow, and prayed only for one thing: that he would simply fall asleep and that this night would not be her last. Several times Amber still tried to call the police, but Daniel would catch her, snatch the phone, and smash it to pieces. The woman also tried to obtain a court order of protection against her husband, but her petition was rejected for some reason. In the end, Amber escaped when Callihan was arrested again and this time sent to prison. While he was not at home, she packed her things and filed for divorce. After his release from prison in 2010, Daniel returned to what he started with: burglaries. His mental health deteriorated and he began to have hallucinations. Soon he was diagnosed with schizophrenia. Because of his mental problems, the man often ended up in temporary holding centers, but his behavior was so terrible that his stay there did not last long. Daniel was very aggressive, constantly got into conflicts, and got into fights with the people around him. One day, he ran around someone else's property completely naked, with a crossbow stolen somewhere. He threatened everyone with reprisals and then set fire to the neighbor's barn. His behavior became more and more reckless and dangerous. And in 2014, Callihan was arrested for violating probation and sent back to prison. In the end, Daniel served 5 years of the 12-year suspended sentence, which was also an insufficient term for him to draw any conclusions. If the authorities had forced the man to spend all 12 years in prison, the victims in today's case would have had a chance to remain alive. Daniel's early release is just one of many mistakes of the system in today's case. Let's move to 2021, when Daniel had turned 30. Having been released from prison about 2 years earlier, still just as angry, with empty pockets and prison tattoos embedded under his skin, he found himself on the street. Callihan lived for a long time in a trailer in Brookhaven, Mississippi. But when he could not pay the rent and began threatening the landlord, he was kicked out and left without a roof over his head. By that time, Daniel had long since burned all bridges with his relatives. There was no one he could turn to for help. There was no family with whom he maintained contact. There were no friends, only accomplices and random acquaintances from shelters. He had nothing except an old worn jacket and, perhaps, a vague desire to survive. And it was then, out of desperation, that he decided to turn to his biological sister, a woman named Dixie. For the last 8 years, Daniel had not communicated with his sister, and there were good reasons for that. The last time Dixie had taken pity on her brother and let him stay with her, he repaid her with black ingratitude. He began to encourage her boyfriend to cheat, cynically inviting him to meet other women behind Dixie's back, not caring about his sister's feelings. It was after such betrayal that the woman threw her brother out the door, and since then they had hardly communicated. However, now Callihan decided to knock on his sister's door again, and it so happened that it was on Christmas. Perhaps the spirit of forgiveness and family unity was in the air. Or maybe Dixie simply remembered their shared nightmarish childhood and how they once held on to each other. Naturally, she felt sorry for her brother. By that time, there was no trace left of the resentment and anger. The woman sincerely wanted to believe that the years spent in prison and wandering the streets had taught Daniel something. She wanted to give him another chance to correct himself and become a human being. Learning that Daniel was sleeping wherever he could and had no place of his own, Dixie allowed him to live for free in an old trailer that stood on the back of her property. It was not a gift, but a probationary period. Dixie, remembering Callihan's character, set clear rules. She really did not want that unpleasant story with the boyfriend to repeat itself, or for her brother to bring his dubious acquaintances into her house. At Dixie's insistent demand, Daniel had to wake up at the crack of dawn every morning, get moving, and go look for work, any work, just so he could start supporting himself and not sit on her neck. Until he found a normal place and got back on his feet, Dixie promised to support him, giving him money for food and possibly driving him to interviews. She hoped that the strict regimen and her help would pull her brother out of the pit he had dug for himself. At first, everything went more or less well. Daniel dutifully got up early in the morning, went out to look for work, and sometimes came back with some news. Dixie began to hope that her faith in her brother had been justified, but soon the idol collapsed and the situation became extremely alarming. One night, when the moon was hiding behind the clouds, Daniel took a shovel. The man went into the forest, which was right behind the fence of Dixie's property, and began to dig furiously. He dug a huge hole there, deep as a grave. Returning before dawn, dirty and out of breath, he explained to Dixie without a shadow of embarrassment that this place was for her boyfriend, whom he planned to kill. The motive was simple and terrible: to take over his sister's house so there would be somewhere to live. In the following days, Daniel several times asked Dixie directly, "Can I bump off your guy?" At first, the woman did not take his words seriously. It seemed to her that her brother was grimly joking, trying to look tough after prison. But when the questions began to repeat every day with increasing persistence, the sister became seriously scared. She firmly explained to Daniel that she loved the father of her children and would not allow anyone, even her own brother, to interfere in the relationship and destroy her family. Callihan, noticing Dixie's fear, pretended that he had simply made an unsuccessful joke and immediately dropped the topic. But all the signs indicated that this man, thoroughly steeped in prison romanticism, thirsted for blood, and it did not matter whose. Things only got worse after that. One cold night, when the wind was blowing through the old trailer, Daniel asked his sister for permission to spend the night on the closed veranda of the house, adjacent to the kitchen. It had gotten sharply colder outside, and there was no heating in the trailer. Dixie, though with apprehension, agreed. After all, he was her brother. He should not freeze on the street. In the middle of the night, Dixie suddenly woke up from a heart-rending, soul-chilling cry. The sound was so terrible that goosebumps ran down her back. She could not understand where it was coming from until she remembered that Daniel was sleeping on the veranda. Carefully looking in there, she saw her brother. He was asleep, but his sleep was terrible. His body was twitching, his hands were clenched into fists, and tears were flowing down his face. He was crying in his sleep, bitterly, sobbing the way only small children or broken people cry. Dixie was seriously frightened and, overcoming her fear, decided to wake her brother. She grabbed a broom and quietly poked him in the back. Daniel jumped up as if scalded by the sudden touch, wildly looking around, which frightened his sister even more. Coming to his senses a little, he admitted that he had been tormented by nightmares ever since he had screwed up. The man sat on the floor of the veranda, clutching his head with his hands, and repeated like a broken record that he had ruined everything, that he had made a mistake, but he never said what exactly he had done. No matter how much Dixie asked about the reasons for such anxiety and fear, her brother grimly remained silent and refused to explain anything. Only later, when the woman, having lost hope for frankness, was already about to go back to the bedroom, Callihan unexpectedly stopped her. Looking somewhere into the corner with empty eyes, he quietly admitted that he had taken a person's life there, in Boga Chito. "I didn't think it would affect me like this," he whispered, and in his voice there was something between fear and bewilderment. Dixie froze in place, not knowing what to think, whether these were hallucinations caused by years of taking prohibited substances, or whether Daniel, her own brother, had really taken someone's life, and now the burden of the cruel crime was strangling him at night, tearing him out of sleep with this terrible childlike crying. She had no answer, but from that night on, a cold fear settled in her soul. A few days later, when they were sitting by the fire in the yard, a song called "Murder in My Thoughts" began to play. Daniel's eyes instantly glazed over. His gaze became empty, as if he had fallen into his terrible memories. And then her brother, looking through his sister, declared in an icy voice, "That's why John Estes got what he deserved." Hearing these words, Dixie went cold. Her heart began to pound furiously. Could it be that her brother had just named the name of a real victim? Not just some random person, but the very one whose death he recalled in his nightmares. Everything inside the woman tightened with horror. No longer able to stay near Daniel and fearing to betray her confusion, Dixie, under a made-up pretext, referred to a sudden stomach pain and feeling unwell. She got up and, trying not to run, walked to her house. Locking the door, Dixie rushed to her laptop. With trembling hands, she turned it on and, praying that it would turn out to be a mistake, typed the name John Estes into the search bar. The search results made her blood run cold. In one of the areas called Boga Chito, the very one her brother had mentioned, 36-year-old Jonathan Paul Estes had disappeared under unclear circumstances. The man had vanished without a trace, and his case, judging by the scant notes in the local crime reports, had never been solved. This could not be a coincidence. The world is too small for such accidents. How could Daniel, who had spent the last few years serving time and wandering the streets, know that the missing man was no longer alive? There could be only one explanation, terrible and irrefutable. Her brother had really taken John Estes' life. Now she knew for sure. Her brother Daniel was a murderer. The realization of this fact lay like a heavy stone on her shoulders. But along with the horror came a grim determination. Dixie wanted to do the right thing as an honest citizen and not let the criminal go unpunished. Gathering all her willpower, she went to the police. In the police station, the young woman was met with a cold shower. No one took her words seriously. The duty officer, tired of the endless stream of people, looked at her with poorly concealed boredom. Moreover, Dixie was essentially accused of having an overactive imagination, with hints that she apparently had mental problems or had watched too many detective series. The investigator threw up his hands and said that they needed physical evidence. The murder weapon, fingerprints, and not vague suspicions from a nervous woman based on fragmentary phrases from her unreliable brother. Apparently, the police themselves did not realize that their job was precisely to check such signals and look for those very pieces of evidence and not to brush them off at the doorstep. Dixie did not know what to do. Her brother had confessed to the crime, but the police did not believe her. She turned to various legal authorities and different sheriff's offices, but everywhere she heard the same thing. Evidence was needed. Her words simply meant nothing. The relationship between brother and sister became increasingly tense, but Daniel, as if not noticing the growing wall of alienation, continued to confide in her from time to time. One evening, sitting on the porch and sipping cheap beer, he confessed to Dixie with some frightening casualness that he had molested a minor. Daniel did not provide any details, neither the name nor the age, nor when it had happened. He simply dropped the phrase into the air as something not worthy of attention and immediately changed the subject, leaving his sister in a state of shock and disgust. For Dixie, this was the last straw. The death of a stranger was monstrous, but somewhere far away. But here and now, it was about a living child, possibly someone from their own circle. The woman shook at the thought that her own brother, who was sleeping on her veranda and whom she was helping to get his life together, could have abused a teenager. Gathering the remnants of her resolve, she went to the sheriff's office again, this time with a statement about a crime against sexual integrity. At the station, they listened to her, but with the same skeptical expression, they formally accepted the statement. An investigation began, which, however, ended immediately. Without names, dates, or specific facts, the case reached a dead end almost right away. Dixie was called in a couple of times for clarification, but she could not provide anything except the phrase, "thrown by her brother." The detectives threw up their hands. No corpus delicti, no victim, no case. Soon the investigation was quietly closed for lack of evidence, writing everything off as another fantasy and ravings of an unreliable relative. Dixie was left alone with her knowledge that her brother was not just a murderer, but also a molester of minors, and that the system she had tried to make work had betrayed her again. Later, Callihan told his sister that he had always wanted to become like his father, but now he had decided to outdo his old man and become not just a criminal, but a serial maniac. He even claimed to be writing a book on the subject. Daniel assured her that he would succeed where his father had failed, and at the same time would be able to avoid punishment. All this was the final blow for Dixie. She was now sincerely afraid of her brother because of his terrible statements and wanted to protect her family. Since the authorities ignored her appeals, the woman did the only thing in her power. She threw Daniel out of her house and forbade him from appearing there. Dixie said that she never wanted to see him again. After that, Callihan found himself on the street again. The man began to wander through various psychiatric institutions, using them as temporary housing. Doctors tried to treat him for schizophrenia and hallucinations, transferring him to other rehabilitation centers, but judging by the subsequent events, they did not achieve great results in treating the difficult patient. By 2024, the situation had worsened, which led to the tragic events that will be discussed further. During this period, Daniel became close with a woman who played an important role in today's story. Her name was Victoria Cox. Victoria was born in 1991. She was a little over 30. She was the mother of 3 children aged 9, 8, and 6. Little is known about her past. For some time, Victoria worked as a nanny at home. How she met Daniel also remained a mystery. Whether they studied together at school, were childhood friends, or a short romance flared up between them. However, they had known each other for many, many years. The whole horror of the situation was that Daniel was planning to do something terrible, and Victoria was going to join him. There was another woman, Callie Jo Brunette, who was 35. According to her relatives, Callie was kind, sociable, and simple-hearted. She called herself a country girl. Callie was a loving daughter, sister, and aunt, but more than anything in the world, she adored her 2 daughters, 4-year-old Erin and 6-year-old Jaylee. The Brunette family was inseparable. There was a special bond between the sisters. The 2 girls, as if made from the same template, looked like 2 peas in a pod. The same light hair that their mom braided into pigtails. The same freckles on their turned-up noses. The same explosive characters. Little Erin, despite her young age, was a real tomboy, feisty and headstrong. She never followed others and always did things her own way, whether it was choosing a toy in the store or deciding when to go to bed. Erin could stand up to anyone who tried to bully her. The boys in the sandbox quickly learned that this girl would not cry and complain, but could boldly fight back both verbally and physically. Sometimes Erin was sharp and capricious, especially if something did not go the way she wanted, but the reason for this was touching. She simply desperately wanted to be like her older sister. She copied her gait, her way of speaking, and demanded the same clothes as Jaylee. It seemed to her that if she was as serious and adult as her sister, the world would treat her with the same respect. In these caprices, one could feel not naughtiness, but a naive desire to grow up, catch up, and surpass the one she looked up to. To some extent, Callie and her 2 daughters could be called a happy family. The idyll was marred only by the fact that Callie had a long-term relationship with Daniel Callihan that had lasted for 13 years. The couple met when both were just over 20. Their romance would fade and then flare up again with new force. In 2024, Callie and Daniel reunited, and the man settled in a tent on the Brunette family property. No details of their relationship at that moment were revealed. Callihan simply lived on the property until Callie demanded that he leave her territory. However, the man did not want to become homeless again, so he refused to move out and tried to negotiate. But Callie was adamant, which caused even greater rage in her boyfriend. By June 2024, the situation had reached its peak. On the night of June 11th to 12th, Daniel was in the mobile home in Louisiana where the Brunette family lived. There, he committed his terrible crime. He attacked Callie and inflicted 50 stab wounds on her. It was a long and brutal attack, full of hatred and malice. It was not a spontaneous act. Most likely, Callihan had thought everything through and chosen the victim in advance. Unfortunately, after the attack, 35-year-old Callie Jo Brunette died. But the story did not end there. After the woman's death, Daniel kidnapped her 2 daughters. He shoved them into Callie's car, got behind the wheel himself, and headed from Louisiana to his home state of Mississippi. On the way, Callihan stopped at a wooded area at Victoria Cox's house and, right from the doorstep, told her everything he had done. He had taken a woman's life and kidnapped her 2 daughters. He asked Victoria to shelter him, and she agreed. This decision turned out to be fatal. A mother who had 3 children of approximately the same age as the kidnapped girls voluntarily became an accomplice to the criminal. Fortunately, Victoria's own children were not living with her at that time. By then, Child Protective Services had taken them away. Considering that she had agreed to help Daniel, who had just committed a crime, it was a wise decision on the part of the Child Protection Service. And then the real horror began. Callihan brought Callie's daughters to Victoria's house and began to molest the older sister, Jaylee, committing abuse against her. When he got physically tired, he handed her over to the owner of the house. And the adult woman, a mother of 3 children, continued the abuse, while Daniel simply sat and enjoyed it. Poor Jaylee, who had become a witness to the murder of her own mother just a few hours earlier, now had to endure the outrages of 2 adults. But the worst was for Erin, who adored her older sister. She saw her suffering and could do nothing to help her. It is impossible to imagine what kind of horror was going on in her head. 12 hours had passed since Daniel took Callie Brunette's life. The next morning, the young woman's parents, worried that they could not reach their daughter, contacted Erin's father, one of the girls, and asked him to check if everything was all right with them. The man was on good terms with his ex-partner, so he immediately went to Callie's house. Parking his car in the driveway, he immediately suspected something was wrong. There was dead silence in the house, and then a terrible picture opened up before him. Callie was lying in a pool of blood in her own bedroom. Her body was mutilated by dozens of wounds. The girls were missing, and Erin's father immediately reported it to the police. At that very moment, an all-points bulletin was issued, and the authorities immediately began searching. Meanwhile, Daniel Callihan contacted his sister Dixie. He wrote her a message on social networks, informing her that he had an emergency. He urgently needed money to replace a flat tire. Dixie immediately understood that her brother was lying, since he had not had a car for a long time. She ignored the message. This hasty decision will haunt the woman for the rest of her life. Dixie still wonders whether, if she had answered her brother then, she could have prevented what happened next or not. In reality, Dixie is the least to blame for what happened, because she repeatedly tried to warn the authorities about Daniel and his criminal tendencies, but she was ignored every time. So let's return to Victoria's house, which in fact was not even her property, but belonged to a relative. Cox lived there while the real owner was away. After the horror she had experienced and the abuse against Jaylee, little Erin could not calm down in any way. She kept crying, screaming, and calling for her mom. Her behavior was driving Daniel crazy. He began to get nervous, and not knowing how to make Erin be quiet, grabbed her and pressed her to his chest, so that she could not breathe. As a result, Erin died from lack of air. The monster hoped that silence would come in the house, but then Jaylee started crying. Her brain was simply unable to cope with the mass of shocks in such a short time. Daniel Callihan could think of nothing better than to throw both sisters into a dirty pit in the backyard. Jaylee was forced to remain alone with the dead body of her sister Erin. So that the captive could not get out of the pit, Callihan set up a barrier around the ditch using an animal cage. Fortunately, the authorities did not sit idle. After the disappearance of the two sisters in Louisiana, they quickly found out that their mother, Callie Brunette's car had been stolen. Using surveillance cameras, the police tracked the car's route to the house where Victoria Cox lived and where Daniel was at that moment with the two captives. Closer to evening, on June 12th, almost a day after the kidnapping, the police arrived at the house and found the two missing sisters in the pit in the backyard. 6-year-old Jaylee was still alive but in terrible condition. Her 4-year-old little sister, Erin, was lying next to her. The authorities did not manage to save her. Callihan and Victoria Cox were immediately taken into custody at the scene of the crime. When the policeman read Daniel his rights, he immediately waived them and made a full confession on camera. He said that he was completely sober and had not taken any prohibited substances except antidepressants prescribed by his doctor, and he had no excuses for what he had done. Later, Callihan told reporters that he was constantly being watched so that he would not commit suicide, but he would still find a way to do it. On camera, he admitted that he regretted it and, in order to speed up the judicial process, agreed not to contest the charges. In Daniel's opinion, a lethal injection was the simplest thing they could offer him. Victoria Cox also voluntarily gave testimony to law enforcement agencies, which fully coincided with everything Callihan had said. She confessed to the molestation and the horrifying details, recounting what Jaylee had to endure. Now that both suspects had confessed to what they had done, they were placed in custody pending trial. People did not understand how a person with a diagnosis of schizophrenia, suffering from hallucinations, could have been calmly released. At the trial, both criminals pleaded guilty. The hearings in their case took place quite recently, at the end of 2025. 38-year-old Daniel Callihan was sentenced to several life imprisonments, deprived of the right to parole. Callihan will not be able to leave this world by means of a lethal injection, but will have to answer for his crimes before other inmates as well. Unfortunately, for the murder of Jonathan Estes, in which Daniel confessed to his sister Dixie, he never faced any punishment. Victoria Cox was sentenced to 40 years in prison. When asked how a mother of 3 children became involved in terrible crimes against minors, the woman did not answer anything and lowered her eyes. If you are finished watching, you're a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and give it a like. See you in the next video.